What would you risk to save the life of someone who represented everything you were fighting against? What if the man bleeding out in front of you wore the most feared uniform of World War II? The deaths of innocent people on his hands, yet his eyes held something you couldn't ignore. A desperate humanity that shouldn't have existed there? And what if hiding him meant not just losing everything you'd worked for, not just facing execution for treason, but betraying every soldier, every victim, every principle that made you join the fight against Nazi Germany in the first place? This is the story of Sister Catherine Hartley, a 29-year-old British Army nurse working in a field hospital in Belgium during the winter of 1944, and the impossible 72 hours that would define the rest of her life. But here's what makes this story cut deeper than any wartime drama you've heard before. Catherine wasn't naive about who she was saving. She knew exactly what the SS represented: the atrocities, the death camps, the systematic murder of millions. She treated Allied soldiers who'd witnessed SS war crimes, who'd liberated concentration camps, who'd seen firsthand the evil this organization perpetrated. She hated the SS with every fiber of her being. And yet, on a frozen December night when a wounded SS officer stumbled into her ward looking for help, when she saw the shrapnel wounds that would kill him without immediate treatment, when he looked at her with eyes that held not arrogance or ideology but pure animal terror of death, Catherine made a choice that would haunt her forever. She hid him under her bed. And what happened in the 3 days that followed would force her to confront questions about humanity, mercy, and justice that have no comfortable answers. Let's start with who Catherine was before that December night, because understanding her choice requires understanding what she'd already survived, what she'd already seen, what had brought her to that moment. Catherine Hartley grew up in Manchester. The daughter of a factory foreman and a schoolteacher, practical people who believed in hard work, duty to country, and the difference between right and wrong. She'd trained as a nurse in the late 1930s, watching Europe slide toward war, watching Hitler's aggression go unchecked, watching the world pretend that fascism could be appeased or contained. When war broke out in September 1939, Catherine enlisted in the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service within weeks. She wasn't running toward adventure or glory. She was running toward the place where she could do the most good, where her skills could save lives, where she could be useful in fighting the greatest evil her generation would face. She spent the early war years in field hospitals in North Africa, treating soldiers wounded in the desert campaigns, learning to perform emergency medicine in tents that shook from nearby artillery fire, holding the hands of dying boys who called for their mothers in the final moments. She was good at her job, respected by doctors for her steady hands and unflappable demeanor under pressure, loved by patients for her gentle efficiency and the way she treated every wounded soldier with dignity, regardless of how severe their injuries. By 1944, Catherine had been transferred to Belgium as Allied forces pushed into occupied Europe. The field hospital where she worked was housed in a partially destroyed monastery. The wards set up in what had been meditation halls and dormitories. The operating theaters in the old refectory where monks once ate in silence. The irony wasn't lost on Catherine, that this place of peace and prayer had become a factory for processing the wounded, that sacred spaces now smelled of blood and disinfectant and the particular odor of gangrenous wounds. The hospital was overwhelmed constantly. After D-Day, as Allied forces ground their way through France and into Belgium, the casualties were staggering. Catherine worked 18-hour shifts, sometimes longer, triaging wounds, assisting in surgeries, changing dressings on burns and shrapnel injuries, writing letters home for soldiers too wounded to hold a pen, closing the eyes of those who didn't make it. She'd become efficient at death, could recognize in the first moments of examining a patient whether they had hours, days, or a fighting chance. She'd learned to compartmentalize grief, to mourn later or not at all, to keep moving because the next wounded soldier was already being carried in. But she hadn't become cold. That's important. Catherine hadn't let the war turn her into someone who stopped seeing patients as individuals. Every wounded soldier had a name, a hometown, people who loved them waiting for news. She remembered their faces even when she couldn't save them, carried their stories like accumulated weight on her shoulders. In November 1944, Catherine's hospital began receiving soldiers who'd participated in liberating Nazi concentration camps in the East, men transferred west after being wounded in subsequent fighting. These soldiers brought stories that made everything Catherine had seen in 4 years of war seem almost comprehensible by comparison. They described camps where human beings were systematically starved, worked to death, gassed in industrial facilities designed for mass murder. They described seeing children with numbers tattooed on their arms, piles of bodies, the walking skeletons of survivors who barely seemed human anymore. And they described the SS guards who'd run these places, who'd reduced murder to bureaucratic routine, who'd turned cruelty into policy. Catherine listened to these stories during the quiet hours of night shifts, when wounded soldiers needed to talk, needed to make sense of what they'd witnessed. And she felt something harden inside her, a crystallization of hate that was new and disturbing. Catherine wasn't a hateful person by nature, but hearing these accounts, understanding the scale and systematic nature of the evil the Nazis had created, she found herself capable of a kind of hate she'd never experienced before. She hated the Nazi regime. She hated the ideology. And yes, she hated the SS, the organization that had been at the forefront of implementing the Holocaust, that wore their death's head insignia like a badge of pride, that represented everything inhuman about the Nazi project. Asterisk, asterisk. So when December 17, 1944 arrived, when what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge erupted with a massive German counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest, Catherine's hospital was caught in chaos. The German advance was faster than anyone expected, breaking through American lines, creating panic and confusion in Allied rear areas. Catherine's hospital received orders to evacuate, to pack up and move west away from the German advance, but the orders came too late. By the time they started loading patients into ambulances, German forces were already in the nearby towns. Roads were blocked, communications were cut. The hospital staff made the decision to stay, to hide patients who could be moved into the monastery cellars, to treat whoever arrived regardless of uniform. And that's when everything changed for Catherine, when the rules she'd lived by for 5 years suddenly became inadequate for the situation she faced. Because the wounded started arriving who weren't Allied soldiers. Belgian civilians caught in crossfire, yes, but also German soldiers, wounded in the same fighting that was wounding Americans and British, bleeding from the same kinds of shrapnel and bullet wounds, dying from the same causes. And Catherine found herself treating them, because wounded soldiers were wounded soldiers, because medical ethics demanded treating whoever needed help, because even enemies were human beings who deserved medical care. But here's where it gets complicated, where Catherine's story diverges from the straightforward moral clarity of treating wounded enemy combatants. On the night of December 19th, Catherine was alone in one of the smaller wards, a room that had been a monk's dormitory, checking on 3 British patients who were stable enough not to need constant monitoring. The hospital was understaffed. Most personnel were in the main wards dealing with fresh casualties, and Catherine was making rounds before the shift change. She heard noise from outside, footsteps in the snow, someone moving near the building's back entrance. Her first thought was that it was German soldiers coming to occupy the hospital, which wasn't uncommon. Both sides generally respected medical facilities even if they commandeered them. She moved to the door to see who was approaching, and that's when she saw him, a figure in a German uniform, SS insignia visible even in the darkness, stumbling toward the building, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. He was badly wounded, holding his side where dark blood seeped between his fingers, his face pale with blood loss and shock. And when he saw Catherine standing in the doorway, this SS officer did something unexpected. He didn't demand treatment or pull a weapon or order her to help him. He stopped. And in German he said simply, "Please, I don't want to die here." Every instinct Catherine had developed over 5 years of war told her to refuse to walk away, to let this man bleed out in the snow because he represented an organization responsible for unspeakable evil. The SS weren't regular soldiers. They were the ideological core of the Nazi regime, volunteers who'd chosen to join Hitler's most fanatical military units, men who'd participated in atrocities across Europe. Catherine had treated victims of SS actions, had heard the stories, had seen the evidence. This man, bleeding in her doorway, might have been at concentration camps, might have executed civilians, might have committed war crimes that would turn her stomach. She should have turned away. She should have closed the door. She should have let justice take its natural course and let this man die from his wounds. But she didn't. And here's the moment that Catherine would replay in her mind for the next 40 years, trying to understand why she made the choice she made. She looked at this SS officer, this representative of everything she was fighting against, and she didn't see a Nazi or an ideology or a war criminal. She saw a human being who was terrified of dying, who was young, probably mid-20s, who was bleeding and alone and asking for help. And some part of Catherine, some part that was stronger than her hate, some part that was more fundamental than her loyalty to the Allied cause, some part that was simply her nature as a nurse, as someone who dedicated her life to saving people, that part wouldn't let her walk away. She pulled him inside. She got him into the small ward, away from the main areas where other staff might see. She examined his wounds quickly, efficiently, her training taking over even as her mind screamed that this was insane. He had shrapnel wounds in his side and leg, deep but not immediately fatal if treated. He'd lost a lot of blood, was in shock, needed surgery to remove the shrapnel and close the wounds. But she couldn't take him to the operating theater, couldn't involve the other medical staff, because the moment anyone else knew she was treating an SS officer voluntarily, she'd be arrested. The standing orders were clear. SS prisoners were to be held separately, treated if medically necessary but under guard, and turned over to military police for war crimes investigation. They were not to be hidden. They were not to be protected. And they certainly weren't to be concealed in a nurse's quarters. Catherine made a calculation that took about 5 seconds, a decision that would alter the trajectory of her entire life. She couldn't perform surgery alone, but she could stabilize him, stop the bleeding, give him morphine for the pain, hide him until she figured out what to do next. She had a small private room adjacent to the ward, little more than a closet with a bed where she slept during breaks. There was space under the bed, not much but enough. She told the SS officer, in the basic German she'd learned from treating posts, that she would help him, but he had to stay quiet, had to trust her, had to give her time to figure out how to handle this. And incredibly, he agreed, nodded, let her half carry him to her room, let her hide him in the narrow space under her bed. For the next hour, Catherine worked with shaking hands to stabilize his wounds, cleaning them with the limited supplies she could sneak from the ward, applying pressure bandages, injecting morphine she signed out under a false patient name. The SS officer, who eventually told her his name was Karl Brenner, drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering in German, sometimes crying out before catching himself and forcing silence. And Catherine found herself talking to him, soothing him the way she'd soothed countless wounded soldiers, telling him in broken German to stay quiet, that she was helping, that he wasn't going to die tonight. It was surreal, this intimate act of mercy towards someone she should have hated, this careful tending of wounds on a man whose organization had caused so much suffering. And yet, in that small room with her hands covered in his blood, Catherine felt a strange clarity. She wasn't thinking about the SS or Nazi ideology or war crimes. She was just being a nurse, doing what nurses do, trying to keep someone alive. It was the simplest thing she'd ever done and the most complicated, but the situation couldn't stay simple. By dawn, Catherine had a wounded SS officer hidden under her bed. She'd used medical supplies under false pretenses. She'd concealed an enemy combatant from her superiors, and she had no plan for what came next. The German offensive was still pushing forward. The hospital was still in chaos. Wounded kept arriving. And Catherine had to maintain her regular duties while somehow keeping Karl Brenner alive and hidden. Over the next 3 days, Catherine lived in a state of constant terror and exhaustion that makes the word overwhelming seem inadequate. She worked her regular shifts, treating wounded Allied soldiers, assisting in surgeries, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while her mind raced with fear that someone would discover what she'd done. During breaks, she returned to her room to check on Brenner, to change his dressings, to give him water and morphine, to empty the improvised bedpan she'd hidden under the bed with him. The logistics were nightmare. How do you hide a grown man? In a room that other staff occasionally entered? How do you dispose of bloody bandages without questions? How do you explain missing morphine from the supply cabinet? Catherine became a criminal, essentially, lying to colleagues she trusted, stealing medical supplies, falsifying records, all to protect someone she knew she shouldn't be protecting. And here's what makes the emotional reality of those 3 days so complex. Catherine started talking to Carl Brenner. Not long conversations, they couldn't risk that, but brief exchanges during the moments when she checked on him. And she learned things that made everything more complicated. Carl was 26 years old, from a small town in southern Germany. He joined the SS in 1939 at 19, full of the propaganda and nationalism that the regime had been feeding German youth for years. He believed he was serving his country, defending Germany against enemies who wanted to destroy it. And yes, he'd done things in service of that belief that he couldn't take back, things he couldn't bring himself to fully describe, but that Catherine could infer from the way his eyes went dead when she asked what units he'd served with. Carl wasn't innocent. He wasn't some pure soul corrupted by circumstance. He'd been part of the machinery of Nazi evil, had participated in actions that any moral framework would condemn. But he also wasn't the monster Catherine had built up in her mind when she thought about the SS. He was a person, complicated and broken and full of the same fear of death that every wounded soldier she'd treated had shown. And that complexity, that unavoidable humanity, even in someone who'd served an inhuman cause, that's what tormented Catherine. Because it would have been easier if Carl had been purely evil, if he'd been the stereotypical Nazi fanatic. She could hate without complication. But he wasn't. He was just a young man who'd made terrible choices, who'd been shaped by propaganda and nationalism, who was now dying slowly in hiding because he'd been on the losing side of history's most justified war. On the second night, Carl developed a fever, his wounds showing signs of infection despite Catherine's care. She knew he needed antibiotics, needed proper surgical intervention, needed care she couldn't provide in hiding. She faced another impossible choice: let him die from infection, which would solve her immediate problem but would mean she'd saved him only to watch him die slowly from preventable causes, or risk everything to get him proper medical care. And here's where Catherine's character showed in ways that still seem incredible. She chose to risk everything. She waited until the middle of the night, when the hospital was quietest, when most staff were either sleeping or dealing with patients in the main wards. She recruited one person, Dr. Marcus Webb, a British Army surgeon she'd worked with for 2 years, someone she trusted implicitly. She told him everything, showed him the hidden SS officer, and asked for his help. Marcus's reaction was what you'd expect: shock, anger, accusations that Catherine had lost her mind, explanations of exactly how severe the consequences would be if they were discovered. But Catherine made an argument that cut through his objections. She said, "We took an oath to do no harm, to treat the sick and wounded regardless of who they are. If we let this man die when we have the ability to save him, we're no better than the people who turn medicine into a tool for genocide. We can hate the SS, we can hate what they've done, but we can't become them. We can't reduce human beings to ideology and let them die based on political calculation. If we do that, the Nazis have won, because they've turned us into people who can watch someone die and feel righteous about it." It was a hell of an argument, imperfect and full of moral complexity, but it convinced Marcus to help. That night, in Catherine's tiny room with minimal equipment and constant fear of discovery, Marcus performed surgery on Carl Brenner by lamplight, removing shrapnel, cleaning infected tissue, stitching wounds properly. Catherine assisted, playing her normal role, handing instruments, monitoring vital signs, wiping sweat from Marcus's forehead as he worked. And Carl, barely conscious from morphine but aware enough to understand what was happening, looked between them with an expression that Catherine would never forget, a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and something that might have been shame. When the surgery was done, when Carl was stabilized and bandaged properly and sleeping under the effects of anesthesia, Marcus pulled Catherine aside and said something that captured the moral vertigo. They were both experiencing, "I just saved the life of an SS officer. I violated military orders, I risked my career and possibly my life. I betrayed every principle that brought me into this war, and I think it was the right thing to do. But Christ, Catherine, I don't know what right means anymore. We're in hell and the normal rules don't work here." The next day, December 21st, the German offensive stalled. Allied forces regrouped, reinforcements arrived, and the German advance began to reverse. Catherine's hospital received word that American forces had retaken the nearby town, that the immediate danger had passed, that they could resume normal operations. And that meant Karl Brenner was no longer in immediate danger from the tactical situation, but was in much greater danger of discovery. Catherine and Marcus faced a new problem. What do you do with an SS officer? You've been hiding and treating when the military police are about to flood the area looking for German soldiers to interrogate? They couldn't turn him in without explaining why they'd hidden him initially. They couldn't keep him hidden indefinitely. And they couldn't just let him go, even if their consciences had allowed it, because where would he go? He was still weak from his wounds, couldn't walk properly, would be picked up immediately by patrols. They were trapped by their own mercy, stuck with the consequences of a choice they'd made in the heat of the moment, but now had to live with in the cold light of restored order. Karl solved the problem for them, but in a way that created new moral complications. On the morning of December 22nd, when Catherine checked on him, he told her that he knew he was putting them at risk, that he understood what they'd sacrificed to save him, and that he wouldn't let them face consequences for an act of mercy. He was going to turn himself in, but he would tell military police that he'd been hiding in the monastery's ruins, that he'd found medical supplies left behind and treated himself, that Catherine and Marcus had never known he was there. He would take full responsibility, face whatever interrogation and prosecution awaited him, but he wouldn't implicate them. Catherine's first reaction was relief, a lifting of the crushing weight she'd been carrying. But then she realized what Karl's plan really meant. He was surrendering to almost certain execution. SS officers captured in late 1944 were being tried for war crimes, were facing military tribunals that regularly handed down death sentences, were being held accountable for the atrocities their organization had committed. By saving Karl's life, Catherine had just extended it long enough for him to face official justice. She'd given him a few extra days or weeks before he was hanged or shot. The mercy she'd shown was temporary, the death she'd prevented was just delayed. And she didn't know how to feel about that. Didn't know if she'd done good or just made the moral calculation more complicated. Before Karl turned himself in, he said something to Catherine that she would remember for the rest of her life. He said, in the broken German and English they'd been using to communicate, "I don't understand why you saved me. You knew what I was. You must have known the things the SS did, but you saw me bleeding and you didn't see SS, you saw a person. I haven't thought of enemy soldiers as people in years. I've thought of them as obstacles, as targets, as abstractions. You reminded me that they're human beings, which makes everything I've done so much worse because I can't hide behind the excuse that I didn't know. You gave me back my conscience right before I'm going to pay for ignoring it. I don't know if that's mercy or cruelty, but I'm grateful for it. Because at least I died knowing that I was wrong, that what I believed was a lie, that the other side, the enemies I thought were subhuman, had more humanity than I ever showed. That's worth dying for. Understanding that I was wrong is worth dying for. Catherine had no response to that. She just nodded, and later that morning, she and Marcus helped Karl walk to the main ward where they turned him over to military police, sticking to the story that he'd been found hiding in the monastery's ruins, that they'd just discovered him. The military police took him away, and Catherine never saw Karl Brenner again. She didn't know what happened to him, whether he was tried and executed or sent to a POW camp, whether he survived the war or died in captivity. She couldn't make inquiries without raising suspicions, couldn't try to find out without revealing her involvement. For all she knew, Karl Brenner died within days of leaving her care, his life extended by maybe a week thanks to her intervention. Or maybe he survived, served time in prison, eventually returned to Germany and tried to build a life from the ruins of his choices. Catherine would never know. And that uncertainty, that lack of closure, was part of the weight she carried. The official record shows nothing about Catherine's involvement in hiding Karl Brenner. The paperwork indicates only that an SS officer was discovered in the monastery, treated for existing wounds, and transferred to military custody. Catherine and Marcus kept their secret, didn't tell anyone what had really happened, maintained the lie through the rest of the war and into their civilian lives afterward. But the secret didn't keep itself easily. Catherine found herself changed by those 3 days, unable to see war the same way, unable to accept the simple narratives of good and evil that sustained most people through the conflict. She'd seen up close how a person could be both victim and perpetrator, how someone could have committed atrocities and still be terrified and human and deserving of some kind of mercy. She'd made choices that violated every rule and probably saved a life that many would argue shouldn't have been saved. And she couldn't reconcile those contradictions. Couldn't find peace with what she'd done or convince herself that it had been wrong. After the war ended in May 1945, Catherine returned to Britain and tried to resume civilian life. She continued working as a nurse, but found she couldn't talk about her war experiences the way other veterans did. Couldn't participate in the celebrations and commemorations. Couldn't frame her service as straightforwardly heroic. She'd done heroic things, had saved countless lives, had served with distinction. But she'd also done this one thing. This act of mercy toward an enemy that she couldn't square with her understanding of herself or the war she'd fought. In 1947, as details about the concentration camps became more widely known, as the full scope of SS atrocities was documented at the Nuremberg trials, Catherine's guilt intensified. She'd saved an SS officer, someone who'd been part of the organization responsible for industrialized murder, someone who might have participated directly in atrocities that the world was only beginning to fully understand. What did that make her? A humanitarian who'd upheld medical ethics under impossible circumstances? Or a traitor who'd prioritized individual mercy over justice for millions of victims? Catherine married in 1949 to a British civil servant named Robert Hartley, who'd served in administrative roles during the war and understood the weight veterans carried even if they didn't talk about it. She had 2 children, tried to build a normal life, succeeded in most external ways. But privately, in diaries that wouldn't be discovered until after her death, Catherine wrestled continuously with the Karl Brenner decision. She wrote, "I saved a Nazi, not a German soldier but an SS officer. Someone who volunteered for the organization that ran the death camps. I knew what the SS was, what they did, and I saved them anyway." Was that right? Can mercy toward an individual be morally correct even when that individual participated in genocide? If I hadn't saved him, he would have died in the snow outside that hospital. Would that have been justice? Would that have been murder? By saving him, did I allow someone who deserved death to escape it? Or did I uphold the principle that every life has value, even the lives of people who've committed evil? I can't answer these questions. 40 years later, I still can't answer them. But I remember his face, the fear in his eyes, the way he looked at me with desperate hope that I wouldn't let him die. And I can't regret responding to that humanity, even if it meant showing mercy to someone who showed none to his victims. Marcus Webb, the surgeon who'd helped Catherine, faced similar struggles. In the 1970s, when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, he gave an interview to his daughter, recorded on tape, where he talked about his war experiences, including the Karl Brenner incident. He said, "Your mother has asked me many times whether we did the right thing that night. And my answer is always the same, I don't know, but I'd do it again. Because the alternative, watching someone die when you have the ability to save them, choosing to let death happen based on political or ideological calculation, that would have killed something in me that I needed to keep alive. The war was full of necessary evils, killing and destruction in service of stopping greater evil. But this was different. This was a moment where I could choose to preserve life instead of end it, where I could act as a doctor instead of as a soldier. And I chose to be a doctor. Maybe that was selfish, maybe I was prioritizing my own conscience over justice for the SS's victims. But I think, and I might be wrong, I think that maintaining that distinction, refusing to let war turn me into someone who could watch death and call it justice, that was important. Not more important than stopping the Nazis, not more important than holding war criminals accountable, but important as a reminder that we were supposed to be better than them, that we were supposed to preserve some space for mercy even in the middle of total war. Asterisk. The moral question at the heart of Catherine's story doesn't have a clean answer, and that's precisely why it matters. On one side, you have the argument that SS officers deserved no mercy, that they'd forfeited their humanity through their participation in atrocities, that letting one die would have been just and appropriate given what their organization did. The SS wasn't just a military unit. It was the primary instrument of Nazi genocidal policy, voluntarily joined by men who believed in racial supremacy and participated in systematic murder. Showing mercy to an SS officer could be seen as betraying the memory of their victims, prioritizing individual sentiment over justice for millions. And if Karl Brenner had participated in specific atrocities, if he'd been at concentration camps or killing actions, then saving his life meant someone who'd committed murder lived when his victims didn't. That's an impossible weight to bear. The knowledge that your mercy might have protected a murderer, but on the other side, you have the argument Catherine made, that reducing people to categories and letting them die based on those categories is exactly what the Nazis did. That preserving the principle that all human life has value, even enemy life, even the lives of people who've committed evil, is essential to maintaining our own humanity. If we start deciding who deserves medical care and who deserves to die based on political or ideological criteria, we're crossing a line that medicine especially cannot cross without becoming an instrument of oppression rather than healing. The Hippocratic tradition demands treating whoever needs treatment. Medical ethics requires setting aside judgment to focus on relieving suffering. And maybe this argument goes, maintaining those principles even in extreme circumstances is more important than the satisfaction of letting an enemy die. Both arguments have merit. Both reflect genuine moral intuitions. And Catherine's choice to save Karl Brenner doesn't resolve the tension between them. What it does is show how impossible moral clarity becomes in wartime. How people faced with real decisions in real moments don't have the luxury of philosophical debate. How sometimes you act on instinct and spend the rest of your life trying to understand what that instinct revealed about who you are. Catherine saw a wounded man and couldn't walk away. That response came from something deep in her character, from her identity as a nurse, from her fundamental inability to watch someone die when she could prevent it. Whether that response was right or wrong, whether it honored or betrayed the cause she was fighting for, she never resolved. But she lived with it, carried it, let it shape how she thought about justice and mercy and the complexity of human nature. In 1989, Catherine did something she'd avoided for 45 years. She tried to find out what happened to Karl Brenner. The Berlin Wall had just fallen, East and West Germany were beginning reunification, and records from the war were becoming more accessible. Catherine, now 74 years old, hired a researcher in Germany to search military and judicial archives for any mention of an SS officer named Karl Brenner, who'd been captured in Belgium in December 1944. It took months, but they found a partial record. Karl Brenner had been held in British custody for 3 months, interrogated about his unit's actions, and then transferred to a war crimes investigation team. The trail went cold there. No record of a trial or execution, no record of imprisonment in any of the major POW camps. Either the documentation was lost or incomplete, or Karl had died during the chaotic final months of the war before formal proceedings could be held. Catherine would never know for certain, but the most likely explanation was that Karl Brenner died in custody sometime in early 1945. His life extended by Catherine's intervention by perhaps 3 or 4 months at most. When Catherine learned this, her reaction, recorded in her final diary entries, was complicated. She felt grief for the young man she'd saved, for the waste of his life regardless of what he'd done. She felt relief that he'd faced some form of justice, even if incomplete. And she felt a strange acceptance that she'd never have closure, never know if her choice had been right, never be able to trace the full consequences of those 3 days in December 1944. She wrote, "I spent decades trying to understand what I did and why. I wanted to know if Karl Brenner deserved the mercy I showed him, if his life was worth saving, if my choice honored or betrayed my principles. But I've realized that these aren't questions that have answers. I responded to a human being in desperate need. That response came from who I am, from my training as a nurse, from my belief that life has inherent value. Whether Karl Brenner was worthy of that response, I'll never know. But I was faithful to who I needed to be. And maybe that's enough. Maybe moral clarity in wartime is a myth, and all we can do is act according to our deepest principles and accept that we'll never know for certain." If we were right, Catherine died in 1995, at age 80, having lived a long life that was, by external measures, normal and successful. She'd been a good nurse, a devoted mother, an active community member. But those who knew her well, her children, her closest friends, sensed that she carried something from the war that never fully released its grip. Her daughter Sarah said in a later interview, "My mother was the kindest person I knew, but there was a sadness in her that never went away. She would stop sometimes in the middle of ordinary activities, and her expression would go distant, like she was somewhere else entirely. When I was older, she told me a little about the war, about the things she'd seen, the choices she'd had to make. She never told me the full story about the SS officer. I only learned that from reading her diaries after she died. But it explains so much about her, about why she was so insistent that we understand that people are complicated, that good and evil aren't simple categories, that mercy sometimes requires us to act in ways that make no logical sense but that preserve something essential about our humanity." The discovery of Catherine's diaries in 1996 and their subsequent donation to the Imperial War Museum created controversy. Some praised her as a hero who'd upheld medical ethics under impossible circumstances, who'd shown that mercy was possible even toward enemies, who demonstrated the kind of moral courage that refuses to dehumanize even when dehumanization would be easier. Others condemned her as someone who'd betrayed her duty, who'd shown inappropriate sympathy to a Nazi, who'd prioritized individual sentiment over justice for the SS's victims. The debate was fierce, with veterans organizations, medical ethicists, historians, and Holocaust survivors weighing in with passionate arguments on both sides. The controversy revealed how raw these questions still were, how difficult it remains to think about individual mercy in the context of systematic evil, how uncomfortable we are with stories that don't fit neat moral categories. One of the most powerful responses came from a Holocaust survivor named Ruth Goldstein, who'd lost her entire family at Auschwitz and who spoke at a symposium about Catherine's diaries in 1997. She said, "When I first heard about this nurse who saved an SS officer, my reaction was rage. The SS murdered my parents, my siblings, everyone I loved. The idea that someone showed mercy to an SS man while my family received none, that felt like a betrayal of their memory. But then I read Catherine Hartley's diaries, read her struggle with what she'd done, read her decades of questioning whether she'd been right. And I understood something important. Catherine's mercy toward Karl Brenner didn't erase my family's suffering. It didn't justify what the SS did, but it proved that even in the darkest times, some people refused to become what their enemies were. The Nazis taught that some lives have no value, that some people can be murdered without moral consequence. Catherine rejected that teaching, even when rejecting it meant showing mercy to someone who'd served the regime that promoted it. I still don't know if she was right to save him, but I understand why she couldn't let him die. And maybe that understanding, that recognition of moral complexity, is what keeps us human when everything else pushes us toward simplification and hate. The broader lesson of Catherine's story isn't about whether her specific choice was right or wrong. It's about the impossibility of moral purity in wartime. The way that doing good sometimes requires doing things that look like betrayal, The recognition that humanity survives in the most unlikely places if we're willing to see it. Catherine saved an SS officer not because she agreed with Nazi ideology or minimized SS atrocities, but because when confronted with a dying human being, her identity as a nurse, as a healer, as someone committed to preserving life, was stronger than her hate. That choice cost her peace of mind, made her question everything she believed about duty and justice and the difference between right and wrong. But it also preserved something in her that total war was designed to destroy: the capacity to see enemies as human, to respond to suffering with compassion rather than satisfaction, to maintain principles even when those principles created impossible contradictions. What makes Catherine's story particularly relevant today, decades after her death, is that we still face these questions about mercy and justice, about individual humanity versus collective guilt, about whether showing compassion to people who've done terrible things makes us complicit in their actions or demonstrates our commitment to values that transcend circumstance. In contemporary debates about criminal justice, about how to treat enemy combatants in modern conflicts, abutre concilium after atrocities, Catherine's impossible choice echoes forward. We want clear answers about who deserves mercy and who deserves punishment. We want simple rules about when compassion is appropriate and when it's betrayal. But Catherine's experience suggests that those clear answers don't exist, that moral courage often looks like confusion and uncertainty, that doing right sometimes means acting in ways that feel wrong and living with that dissonance forever. Asterisk, the physical space where Catherine hid Karl Brenner no longer exists. The monastery that housed the field hospital was demolished in the 1960s, replaced by modern buildings. But the Imperial War Museum in London has preserved Catherine's diary, the handwritten pages where she documented those 3 days in December 1944 and the decades of reflection that followed. Visitors can read her words, see the evolution of her thinking, trace how she moved from certainty to doubt to a kind of hard-won acceptance that some questions don't have answers. The museum also has Marcus Webb's recorded testimony, where he talks about the surgery performed by lamplight, about the fear they both felt, about the strange intimacy of saving an enemy's life. These artifacts don't provide moral clarity, but they provide something perhaps more valuable: evidence that people in impossible situations struggled with the same questions we struggle with, that moral complexity isn't a modern invention, that courage can look like mercy even when mercy seems like betrayal. Asterisk, Catherine's children inherited their mother's commitment to seeing complexity in human nature. Her son, David, became a social worker specializing in rehabilitation programs for violent offenders, drawn to the question of whether people who've done terrible things can be redeemed, whether mercy toward individuals serves larger justice or undermines it. He said in an interview, "My mother taught me that people are more than their worst actions, that recognizing someone's humanity doesn't mean excusing what they've done." She saved an SS officer's life while fully knowing what the SS represented. She didn't do it because she thought Nazi ideology was acceptable or because she minimized their crimes. She did it because when faced with a specific human being who was dying, she couldn't reconcile letting him die with who she needed to be. That's a different calculation than making policy about how to handle war criminals or deciding appropriate punishment for atrocities. It's about what happens in the moment when abstract principles collide with concrete suffering. When you have to decide who you are by what you do, not just by what you believe. Asterisk, Catherine's daughter, Sarah, took a different path but carried forward the same moral questions. She became a human rights lawyer working with international tribunals prosecuting war crimes, including tribunals dealing with atrocities in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. She said, "People ask me how I can work prosecuting war criminals when my mother saved an SS officer. Don't I see the contradiction? But I don't think there is one. My mother's act of individual mercy doesn't undermine the necessity of justice for mass atrocities. Both are necessary. We need systems that hold people accountable for genocide, that say clearly that certain actions are unacceptable and will be punished. But we also need individuals who, in moments of direct confrontation with suffering, choose compassion over hate. My mother wasn't making policy about how to treat Nazi war criminals. She was responding to a specific person in a specific moment, and her response, keeping him alive, didn't prevent justice. Karl Brenner was turned over to authorities, faced interrogation, presumably faced some form of accountability, even if the records are incomplete. What my mother did was refuse to become an executioner, refuse to let someone die when she could prevent it. That's not the same as saying he shouldn't face trial or shouldn't be held responsible for his actions. The question that haunts discussions of Catherine's story is this: what if Karl Brenner had been directly involved in atrocities? What if Catherine had known, not suspected but known with certainty, that the man under her bed had participated in mass murder, had been at concentration camps, had personally killed innocent people? Would her choice still have been defensible? This is where the moral philosophy gets truly difficult, where arguments about abstract principles meet the concrete reality of blood on specific hands. Catherine never knew exactly what Karl had done. He'd been part of the SS, which meant he was part of the organization running the Holocaust, but individual culpability varied enormously within that organization. Some SS officers ran death camps. Others fought as military units with minimal involvement in genocidal operations. Karl might have been a war criminal in the deepest sense, or he might have been someone who'd made a terrible choice about which organization to join, but hadn't personally committed atrocities. Catherine never knew, and that uncertainty was both a comfort and a torment. A comfort because she could tell herself that maybe the man she saved wasn't a murderer, maybe he was just a soldier fighting for the wrong side. A torment because she might have saved someone who'd participated in genocide. Someone whose life should have ended in that snow as rough justice for the lives he'd taken. Asterisk in her final diary entry, written a week before her death. Catherine addressed this question directly. If I'd known for certain that Karl Brenner had murdered innocent people, would I have made the same choice? I've asked myself this question 10,000 times, and I still don't know the answer. I want to say no, that there are some acts so evil that mercy becomes complicity. But I remember his face, the terror of death I saw there, the humanity that existed despite and alongside whatever evil he'd done. And I think, God help me, I would have saved him anyway. Not because I think murderers deserve saving, not because I minimize the evil of taking innocent life, but because I couldn't let someone die when I had the power to save them without becoming someone I couldn't live with. Maybe that makes me complicit in his crimes? Maybe it makes me a bad person who prioritized her own conscience over justice for victims. Or maybe it makes me someone who understood that revenge isn't justice, that letting someone die in front of you isn't punishment or accountability but just more death. I'll never know if I was right. But I know I couldn't have chosen differently and remained Catherine Hartley. Nurse, someone who dedicated her life to preserving life. That identity was more fundamental to me than my identity as a British soldier or an enemy of Nazism. And when those identities conflicted, when I had to choose which one defined my actions in that moment, I chose the identity that said life has value. Even his life. Even then, this confession, this raw honesty about the impossibility of her position, is perhaps the most valuable part of Catherine's legacy. She doesn't offer a neat resolution. She doesn't claim that her choice was definitely right or that anyone else in her position should make the same one. She just testifies to the reality of moral vertigo, the experience of making choices that seem simultaneously right and wrong, necessary and betraying, courageous and cowardly. And she offers evidence that living with that uncertainty, carrying that weight, is possible, even if it's not comfortable. Catherine lived a full life despite never resolving the moral questions her wartime choice created. She raised children who became thoughtful adults working toward justice in their own ways. She contributed to her community. She remained, by all accounts, a good and decent person. But she never stopped questioning that December night, never stopped examining her choice from different angles, never achieved the certainty. The historical context of Catherine's choice matters for understanding its full significance. December 1944 was a moment when the Nazi Reg's evil was becoming fully visible, but the war's outcome was still uncertain. Allied forces had liberated Paris, had crossed into Germany. But the Battle of the Bulge showed that German forces still had the capacity to mount serious counteroffensives. The concentration camps were being liberated and the full scope of the Holocaust was emerging. But that information was still fragmentary, still being processed. Still so enormous that human minds struggled to accept it. Catherine existed in that transition moment, knowing the Nazis were evil but not yet knowing the full depth of that evil. Understanding that the SS was a criminal organization but not yet having seen the documentation that would emerge at Nuremberg. Would she have made the same choice 6 months later, after more camps were liberated, after more evidence was compiled, after the systematic nature of Nazi genocide was undeniable? She thought so, but acknowledged she couldn't know for certain. All she knew was what she did in the moment she was given. With the information and moral framework she had available, there's also the question of what Karl Brenner's survival meant for the arc of history, however infinitesimally. If he lived into early 1945, if he was interrogated as records suggest, what information might he have provided? Did Catherine's choice to save him potentially lead to intelligence that helped Allied forces, that saved other lives, that shortened the war, however marginally? Or did it simply extend one man's life by a few months without broader consequence? We can't know. The counterfactual is too complex. But it raises the philosophical question of whether outcomes determine the morality of choices, or whether the rightness or wrongness of an action exists independent of its consequences. Catherine acted from principle, from her identity as a healer, not from calculation about what effects her choice might have. If Karl Brenner had survived the war and gone on to testify about SS atrocities, helping document the Holocaust for future generations, would that retroactively justify Catherine's choice? Or would it be irrelevant to the moral status of showing mercy to an enemy? These are the kinds of questions that moral philosophers debate, but for Catherine they weren't abstract. They were the daily reality of living with a choice she couldn't unmake and couldn't fully evaluate. Marcus Webb, the surgeon who helped Catherine, provided another perspective in his final interview. He said, "People want to know if we were right to save Karl Brenner. And the answer I give is this: I don't know if we were right, but I know we weren't wrong in the way you might think. We didn't save him because we sympathized with Nazis or because we thought SS officers deserved special treatment. We saved him because we were doctors and nurses, and our professional identity required us to treat whoever needed treatment. You can argue that our professional ethics should have been overridden by the larger moral calculus of who deserves to live and die in wartime. But if we'd accepted that argument, if we'd let our role as soldiers or as opponents of Nazism override our role as medical professionals, we would have been accepting the principle that medicine can be conditional, that healing can be withheld based on political criteria. And that's a principle that the Nazis themselves embraced, that some lives are worthy of medical care and others aren't. We couldn't become that, couldn't let the war turn us into people who'd weaponize medicine. So we saved him. And if that was wrong, if that was a betrayal of everyone fighting against Nazi Germany, then I accept that judgment. But I don't think it was. I think it was maintaining a line that needed to be maintained, preserving a principle that mattered even when, especially when, maintaining it was difficult and confusing. This argument, that medical ethics must remain inviolate even in wartime, is powerful but not universally accepted. Critics point out that doctors and nurses are also citizens, also participants in the moral communities they serve, also obligated to consider the larger consequences of their actions beyond immediate professional duty. By that logic, Catherine had an obligation to her fellow Allied soldiers, to the victims of Nazi atrocities, to the cause of defeating fascism, that should have outweighed her professional obligation to treat whoever needed treatment. Saving an SS officer's life potentially helped the Nazi cause, even if only infinitesimally, by keeping one of their officers alive. And even if Karl Brenner was quickly recaptured and faced justice, Catherine couldn't have known that when she made her choice, she was acting on principle without knowledge of outcomes, which is either the purest form of moral courage or the most dangerous form of moral blindness. Depending on your perspective, the debate about Catherine's choice mirrors larger debates about how we should think about individual moral responsibility and collective evils. Was every German soldier guilty of Nazi crimes by virtue of serving in the German military? Was every SS officer a war criminal regardless of their specific actions? Or were there degrees of culpability, spaces for individual moral complexity within monstrous systems? Catherine's story forces us to grapple with these questions, not as abstract philosophical puzzles, but as concrete decisions with life and death consequences. When she looked at Karl Brenner, bleeding in the snow, she had to decide in that moment whether his uniform made him irredeemably evil or whether his humanity persisted despite his participation in an evil cause. She chose to see his humanity and spent the rest of her life questioning whether that choice honored or betrayed her deepest values, the physical act of hiding. Karl Brenner. The sheer logistical difficulty and danger of it is worth reflecting on because it emphasizes how complete Catherine's commitment to her choice was. This wasn't a moment of impulsive compassion that she could later pretend hadn't happened. This was 3 days of sustained risk, constant fear, elaborate deception, criminal activity in military terms. Catherine stole morphine. She falsified medical records. She lied to colleagues she trusted. She enlisted Marcus Webb as an accomplice, putting his career and freedom at risk. She performed medical care that violated explicit orders about how SS prisoners should be handled. Every one of those actions, taken separately, could have led to court-martial. Taken together, they constituted a systematic betrayal of military discipline and Allied solidarity. Catherine wasn't naive about this. She understood exactly what she was risking and kept doing it anyway. Kept checking on Karl Brenner, kept changing his bandages, kept stealing supplies, kept lying because having made the initial choice to save him, she couldn't then abandon him to die from neglect. The logic of mercy, once accepted, required seeing it through regardless of cost, and the cost was significant even though Catherine was never caught. The psychological weight of maintaining that secret, of knowing she'd done something that would be viewed as treason by many of her colleagues, of carrying that knowledge through the rest of the war and into peacetime that was a price she paid daily. Catherine developed insomnia that lasted for years, would wake in the night panicked that someone had discovered what she'd done, that military police were coming to arrest her. She became hypervigilant about record-keeping, terrified that some discrepancy in medication logs or supply inventories would reveal her theft. She distanced herself from other nurses, afraid that too much closeness might lead to confession, that she might slip and reveal what she'd done. The isolation was profound, the weight of carrying a secret that she couldn't share without destroying herself and Marcus. And this isolation persisted even after the war because the risk of revelation didn't end with peace. If anything, it intensified as war crimes trials proceeded, as the full documentation of SS atrocities emerged, as public sentiment hardened against anyone who'd shown sympathy or mercy to Nazis. In 1961, when Adolf Eichmann was captured and tried in Jerusalem, Catherine watched the proceedings on television with a mixture of fascination and dread. Here was one of the architects of the Holocaust, facing justice for his crimes. And Catherine found herself thinking constantly about Karl Brenner, wondering if he'd been involved in similar operations, whether the man she'd saved had blood on his hands comparable to Eichmann's. The trial brought up all the questions she'd been living with for 17 years, made them immediate and urgent again. She wrote in her diary during the trial, watching Eichmann, hearing the testimony about what the SS did. I feel physically sick thinking that I might have saved someone who participated in that machinery of death. But I also noticed something else. Eichmann is being tried. He's facing justice through a legal process that recognizes his humanity enough to give him a defense attorney, that follows rules of evidence, that treats him as a moral agent responsible for his choices. The court isn't letting him die in the street. They're holding him accountable through civilized means that acknowledge he's human enough to be judged. If that's the right way to handle even someone as culpable as Eichmann, then maybe my choice to keep Karl Brenner alive so he could face similar accountability wasn't the betrayal I feared it was. Maybe mercy and justice aren't opposites. Maybe mercy is what makes justice possible. Because justice requires treating people as moral agents who can be held responsible, not animals who can just be killed. This insight that mercy can be a prerequisite for justice rather than its opposite was important for Catherine's later peace of mind, such as it was. She began to reframe her choice not as choosing Karl Brenner over his victims, but as refusing to become an executioner, maintaining the principle that even enemies deserve due process rather than summary death. This didn't fully resolve her doubts, because she still didn't know what Karl had done, whether he'd been tried, whether justice had actually been served. But it gave her a framework for understanding her actions that didn't require either complete self-condemnation or complete self-justification. She'd done something morally complex, something that existed in the space between heroism and betrayal, and the complexity itself was the truth of wartime moral experience. Asterisk. The relationship between Catherine and Marcus Webb after the war was marked by their shared secret and shared uncertainty. They remained in contact, exchanged letters, occasionally met for coffee when Marcus visited London. But their friendship was haunted by those 3 days in December 1944, by the knowledge that they'd both crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, that they'd made choices that violated their duties as allied military personnel, even as those choices honored their identities as medical professionals. In one letter from 1956, Marcus wrote to Catherine, "Do you ever wonder what happened to him?" "I do. I find myself hoping he survived, which seems absurd given what the SS did. But I invested so much in keeping him alive, performed surgery under impossible conditions, risked everything to save one enemy soldier, and I want to know that it mattered, that the life I saved continued. But I also hope he faced justice, hope that our mercy didn't allow him to escape accountability. Can those two hopes coexist? Can I want him alive and want him punished? I don't know. But I think about him more than I should, wonder what he made of being saved by enemy doctors, whether it changed how he thought about the war or about us or about anything. We're never going to know. That's what haunts me. The uncertainty. The impossibility of ever knowing if we did the right thing, asterisk. Catherine's response to that letter reveals her own evolving thinking. We did an impossible thing, Marcus. We chose mercy in a situation where mercy seemed like betrayal. We chose life in a situation where death might have been justice. We acted according to our deepest principles, even though those principles conflicted with our duties and possibly with the larger, moral requirements of fighting Nazi Germany. And we're never going to have certainty about whether we were right. But I've decided that uncertainty is the true moral reality of war. People who are certain they made only right choices probably didn't face genuinely impossible situations. The fact that we're still questioning, still doubting, still struggling with what we did, that suggests to me that we were actually engaging with the moral complexity rather than simplifying it. We didn't let hate make our decisions easy. We didn't let tribal loyalty override our professional ethics. We didn't become the kind of people who can watch someone die and call it justice. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe we should have become those people, should have let the war turn us harder and simpler. But I don't think I could have and remain myself. And maybe that's the only standard we can hold ourselves to. Did we act according to who we needed to be, knowing we'd have to live with the consequences? Asterisk. This exchange between Catherine and Marcus, preserved in their correspondence now held at the Imperial War Museum, provides insight into how people navigate impossible moral choices over time. They didn't resolve their doubts. They didn't achieve certainty. But they found a way to live with uncertainty, to accept that they'd done something profoundly complicated that didn't fit neat moral categories, but that reflected their deepest values even in conflict with their duties. This kind of moral maturity, the ability to hold contradictory truths simultaneously, to accept that you might have been both right and wrong, to live with that tension rather than forcing false resolution, that's perhaps the most valuable lesson their experience offers. Asterisk. The final piece of Catherine's story comes from her grandchildren, the generation born decades after the war, who grew up knowing their grandmother as a kind elderly woman who'd served as a nurse in World War II, but who carried some sadness they couldn't quite understand. When Catherine's diaries were published posthumously, her grandchildren, then adults themselves, finally learned the full story. One of them, Emma Hartley, Catherine's oldest granddaughter, wrote an essay about discovering what her grandmother had done. She said, "Learning that my grandmother hid an SS officer under her bed was shocking, but what struck me more was reading her decades of wrestling with that choice, seeing how it shaped her entire life even though she never spoke about it. She taught us, her grandchildren, to be kind, to see complexity in people, to resist simplistic thinking about good and evil. Now I understand where that teaching came from. It came from having made an impossible choice and lived with the consequences. She wasn't teaching us abstract philosophy. She was teaching us what she'd learned from the hardest experience of her life, that humans are capable of both tremendous evil and unexpected mercy, that the same person can be perpetrator and victim, that our capacity to see each other's humanity is what separates civilization from barbarism. My grandmother wasn't a saint. The story about Karl Brenner proves that. Saints don't face moral dilemmas because saints always know what's right. My grandmother was something more valuable, a human being who faced an impossible situation and acted according to her deepest principles even when those principles led to choices she couldn't fully defend. That's a harder and more important kind of moral courage, this generational transmission of moral complexity. The way Catherine's impossible choice became a teaching moment for her descendants suggests that even unresolved moral struggles have value. Catherine never knew if she was right to save Karl Brenner, but her questioning, her refusal to either completely justify or completely condemn her actions, her willingness to live in moral uncertainty, that modeled a kind of ethical seriousness that influenced how her children and grandchildren thought about justice and mercy and human complexity. She didn't pass on answers. She passed on the ability to ask difficult questions, to resist easy moralizing, to see situations from multiple perspectives simultaneously. And in a world that constantly pressures us toward simplistic thinking, toward seeing people as either purely good or purely evil, toward reducing complex situations to tribal allegiances, that capacity for nuanced moral thinking might be exactly what we most need. So what is Catherine Hartley's legacy? She saved one life that probably shouldn't have been saved. At least not in the way she saved it, not by hiding him and treating him in secret and lying to her colleagues. She violated military orders, medical protocols, and the bonds of loyalty to her fellow Allied forces. She showed mercy to an SS officer while millions of innocent people were receiving none from the organization he served. By every conventional measure of wartime morality, her choice was wrong. But she also preserved something essential about her humanity, refused to let war turn her into someone who could watch death and feel righteous about it, maintained her identity as a healer even when healing meant helping an enemy. And she spent the rest of her life questioning that choice, examining it from every angle, never achieving certainty but never abandoning the struggle to understand what she'd done and why. That struggle, that willingness to live with moral complexity rather than forcing false clarity, that's perhaps the most important part of her story. Because we all face choices, hopefully less extreme than Catherine's, where our principles conflict, where doing right in one framework means doing wrong in another, where we have to decide who we are by what we do. And Catherine's example suggests that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is act according to our deepest values, accept that we might be wrong and carry the weight of that uncertainty rather than forcing answers that don't exist. She saved an enemy, questioned that choice for 50 years, and taught everyone who knew her story that moral courage often looks like doubt, that certainty is often a sign of not having really grappled with complexity, that humans are capable of being both more evil and more merciful than we want to believe. That's not a comfortable legacy, but it might be an honest one, and in telling stories about World War II, honesty about moral complexity might be the greatest service we can offer to the memory of those who lived through humanity's darkest hour.